Okay, so today we are going to be looking at something a little different.
Yeah.
You sent this to us as the learner, and it's called Self-Defense Techniques and How to Win a Street Fight.
Yeah.
And Using Mind Power, Spiritual Energy.pdf
Quite a title.
by James Goi Jr. And we're going to try to break this down and pull out the most important insights from it all for you.
It's definitely not your typical martial arts book.
Right.
What really stands out to me is that Goi, he also writes about attracting wealth using the power of the mind, combines these physical self-defense techniques with these discussions about mental strength and spiritual energy even.
Yeah.
It's this really personal approach to staying safe.
It really is. And you get the sense that this is coming from a very personal place.
Definitely.
He talks about his partner, Kathy, who really inspired him to write this.
Oh, interesting.
And it seems like it's coming from this real desire to protect her and to protect you as the learner by extension.
Makes sense.
And he even dedicates this book to his father.
Yeah. Who was a correctional officer known as the Legend.
That's awesome.
Right. So you get the sense that he's got this very grounded perspective on all this.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that he's not like a self-defense expert, right? He says that right up front, some of these things that he talks about could be dangerous or even illegal.
Right.
So, he makes sure to say that this is for informational purposes only.
Yeah.
And you should definitely seek professional guidance.
Right.
And he and the publisher, they're not responsible if anyone misuses any of this information.
Okay, so that's a really important point for you as the learner to keep in mind as we go through all this.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that, this was not a quick project.
Yeah.
It took him over 2 years to write this.
Wow.
With a lot of pauses and revisions before it was finally published in 2021.
Okay.
And he didn't even document the fighting moves at first.
Interesting.
He was really thinking of this as like his own personal notes.
Got it. So it's a really interesting, evolving view of self-defense that we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
So naturally, I think we should start with his martial arts journey.
Sounds good.
So in chapter 1, he talks about his first experiences with martial arts.
Okay.
After he moved from New Jersey to California.
Okay.
And it's interesting that he didn't really deeply immerse himself in any one particular style.
Right.
He mentions training in Tang Soo Do, Haitian Yi, karate, and Chinese Kempo.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, so it seems like he was really experimenting with different approaches.
Yeah, and then he moved on to self-study using books and online videos.
Right, and what I thought was really interesting was that he puts a lot of emphasis on thinking about self-defense.
I see.
Not just, learning the moves, but actually thinking about the strategies and the concepts.
That makes sense.
Right, and that kind of critical thinking really extends to how he views some traditional martial arts techniques.
Okay.
He's pretty skeptical about high kicks.
Really?
In real street fights. He says that his roundhouse kicks always felt weak.
I see.
And he agrees with the idea that you should keep your kicks low.
Okay.
For him, high kicks are not really practical. You're more likely to lose your balance.
Yeah.
They might not be sustainable as you get older.
Right. Makes sense.
Right. So, that seems to make sense in a chaotic real-world scenario.
Yeah.
All these fancy high-flying moves.
Yeah.
They might look cool.
Right.
But if you're in real danger, you want to be efficient.
Exactly.
And you want to hit those vulnerable spots.
That's right.
Right. So this kind of leads into his next point, which is the reality of violent encounters.
That's a good point.
And one thing that he suggests, which is a little bit unsettling, is that you should watch real violent incidents online.
Oh, wow.
Like street fights, bar fights, unprovoked attacks.
Yeah.
He says that until you actually see the brutality, like stabbings, sucker punches, attacks on people who are already down.
Oh, wow.
You can't really appreciate the danger.
Yeah.
And he actually shares a story of watching security footage of a woman being brutally kicked down a flight of stairs.
Oh, that's terrible.
It is a tough recommendation.
Yeah.
But his point is that you need to face this unpleasant truth of violence.
I see.
And you need to know how important it is to stay out of those situations and have some strategies if you can't avoid them.
Definitely.
So he really lays out those two main goals for personal safety.
Okay.
It's not about, this idealized version of martial arts combat, but it's really about survival.
Makes sense.
And it's in this really stark context that he introduces his preferred approach to self-defense.
Okay.
He calls it the side stance and the low side kick.
Interesting.
And he talks about his own sparring experiences, and he says that he always felt less vulnerable to kicks when he was in a side stance.
Right, I can see that.
Right. So what are the advantages of using a side stance? Well, he thinks that it gives you several benefits. It makes you less susceptible to front and back leg kicks.
Right.
Because you can either step back or use a low side kick to block, or even strike at the attacker's front leg.
Interesting.
Like targeting the knee.
Right.
He also suggests that moving back in a side stance can help you avoid those big circular punches that are so common in street fights.
So it's about keeping your distance and having a quick, low counter ready to go.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And he even gives specific examples of how to use this approach.
Like what?
So if someone's rushing in to grab you, or if there's a second attacker coming from behind, he says your primary response should be that low side kick to the front leg.
Got it.
Combined with a quick pivot to face the new threat.
So you can address either one.
Exactly.
That's really practical.
Right. And he even considers this a crucial defense against a knife attack.
Really?
He says you really want to aim for the attacker's knee to knock them off balance. But he's very clear that even if someone's on the ground with a knife, there's still a huge threat.
Absolutely.
So, still be really careful.
Always.
And to really kind of hammer home this idea of how vulnerable the knee is, he tells a story about accidentally kicking his training partner's knee in the dojo.
Oh, wow.
And how much of an effect it had, even though it was a really light kick.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it sounds like that experience really convinced him about the power of low kicks.
Right.
So next he moves on to another really important element of self-defense awareness.
Makes sense.
And he's not talking about like some kind of mystical awareness here. He's talking about being aware of your surroundings. Which he thinks a lot of people really lack.
Yeah, I think so too.
Right. We've all seen people walking around totally oblivious to what's going on around them.
Yeah, their faces in their phones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just making themselves easy targets.
Right.
And what's interesting here is that he says...
Predators often rely on the element of surprise.
Oh.
Right? So if you show that you're paying attention, you might deter them.
I see.
If you walk into a new place and you look around, you're scanning for potential threats.
That makes sense.
You're not an easy target.
Right.
But of course, it's hard to stay vigilant all the time.
Yeah, it is.
Especially in crowded places.
Especially.
So he suggests avoiding those situations if you're concerned.
Okay.
He also talks about the dangers of being in isolated locations.
Right.
Where there are not many witnesses.
No one to help.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And to kind of illustrate how danger can just come out of nowhere.
Okay.
He tells this story about a camping trip on the Colorado River.
Oh, wow.
Where his group was confronted by two men with shotguns.
Oh, no.
And it sounds like it was this really tense situation, but luckily, no shots were fired.
That's a relief.
It is.
Yeah.
But it shows you how quickly things can escalate even when you least expect it. Yeah. And that leads us to a really interesting part of this book, the mind, power, and spiritual energy part.
This is where it really starts to get a little unconventional.
For sure.
He explores the idea that maybe our minds or some kind of spiritual energy can actually influence events, even if you don't realize it.
Yeah.
He refers back to that shotgun incident on the river, and he actually suggests that he thinks his spiritual will played a part in stopping those men from shooting.
Okay, that's a pretty big claim.
It is. Yeah.
Does he have any other examples?
Yeah, he does. He tells another story about being in a car with a driver who seemed really determined to go the wrong way.
Okay.
And he describes yelling and like focusing all of his will. And he says that the steering wheel actually seemed to resist turning in the wrong direction.
Oh, wow.
And he believes that his mental effort somehow influenced the driver to take them to the airport without saying a word.
Okay, that's pretty interesting.
Right. So these are some pretty unusual claims.
Yeah.
And he presents them as examples of this inner power that we all have that we can use to avoid dangerous situations without actually fighting.
That's a cool idea.
And he even has this really unique example about mice in his house.
Really?
Yeah. So he had been hearing noises in his attic for months.
Oh, yeah.
And he'd only caught one mouse.
Right.
And then he describes yelling and mentally projecting this idea of a rodent-free attic. And then his trap caught 3 mice all at once.
Wow.
Followed by a 4th one a little while later.
That's wild.
Right. And he interprets this as him using mind power in self-defense against these mice.
It's a different way of looking at it.
It is, yeah.
Definitely.
And he even extends this idea to financial self-defense.
What does he mean by that?
So he talks about using mind power to attract financial gains to overcome debt.
Right.
And he kind of frames this as protecting yourself against the stress and danger of not having enough money.
That's an interesting way to think about it.
Right. So how does he say we can cultivate this protective influence of mind power and spiritual energy?
Right. Good question.
Well, he lays out a series of steps.
Okay.
So the first one is to remember those times in your life when something almost miraculous happened.
Okay.
The second step is to really desire this kind of influence in your life.
Got it.
The third step is to ask or pray for it.
Okay.
He sees prayer as a kind of metaphysical technique.
That's interesting.
The fourth step is to actually work on developing your mind power and spiritual energy through learning and practice.
Makes sense.
The fifth step is to try to raise your frequency.
Your frequency.
Yeah, like aiming for happiness and peace.
Oh, I see.
The sixth step is to practice kindness and be benevolent.
Okay.
The seventh step is to respect and love yourself.
Right.
Which means taking care of your health and avoiding unnecessary risks.
Yeah, that's important.
And finally, the eighth step is to actively participate in your own safety.
So it's a mix of practical advice and more spiritual ideas.
Right. And despite this focus on the power of the mind, he does dedicate a lot of the book to the realities of fighting.
That makes sense.
And chapter 6 is actually called Fighting as a Last Resort.
Okay.
And he says very clearly that fighting is bad.
Right.
And should only be your absolute last resort.
Your plan Z.
Exactly. He really emphasizes that avoidance is the priority.
Makes sense.
So running, distractions, de-escalation, those should always come first.
For sure.
And he also brings up a really important point about the legal implications of self-defense.
That's true.
You know, even if you're acting in self-defense, you could still face legal consequences.
Yeah, you can get in trouble.
Exactly.
That's important to remember.
And that just reinforces his point that the best way to win a fight is to not be in one at all.
I agree.
Right? And he talks about how you should conduct yourself in a way that minimizes the chances of needing to defend yourself physically.
Okay, that's good advice.
But if a physical confrontation does become unavoidable, his advice really changes.
Oh, how so?
He says if you're forced to fight,
you
need to act like your life depends on it.
That's serious?
Because it might.
Right.
He encourages you to kind of make this mental shift where you're the predator and the attacker is the prey.
Interesting.
If you're facing multiple attackers, he suggests focusing on one at a time, creating space, and using anything in your environment as a weapon.
Got it.
He also really advises against going to the ground in a street fight.
Why is that?
Well, because you're more vulnerable to multiple attackers.
Right.
And he himself doesn't have a lot of expertise in ground fighting.
Okay, that makes sense.
But he does say that if you are taken down, you should fight with your knees, your elbows, you know, even biting.
Right, whatever it takes.
Exactly.
So it's all about being as practical as possible in a dangerous situation.
Right. And then he moves on to this idea that simplicity is key in self-defense.
Okay.
He argues that you don't need to know all these complicated techniques.
Right.
Just a few well-practiced moves that you can use in different situations can be really effective.
That makes sense.
And of course, the low side kick is his primary example.
Right.
He really stresses practicing footwork, speed, accuracy, and power.
Okay.
And he backs this up with his own sparring experiences. He says that his side kick approach was really effective against people of different skill levels.
So that'll test it in a way.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And then he introduces this preemptive technique called the leopard paw strike.
The leopard paw? What's that?
It's a strike to the throat.
To the throat.
Yeah. And he says you can use it to stop punches and kicks and grabs.
Wow.
And even as a defense against a knife.
Really?
If you use your other hand to protect yourself.
Okay, so it's like a multi-purpose strike.
Right. And he also gives you a list of vulnerable areas on the body.
Okay.
So things like the top of the foot, the groin, the neck, the jaw, the nose, the eyes, the temples.
Those are all sensitive areas.
Right. And he says you should research and practice how to attack these targets.
Got it.
So it's all about simplicity, directness, and knowing where to hit.
That makes sense.
And then he comes back to situational awareness again.
Okay.
And he expands on it beyond just noticing potential threats.
In what way?
He recommends a specific tactic, which is holding your hands up with open palms.
Okay.
This shows that you're not being aggressive, but it also keeps you ready to defend yourself.
I see.
He also talks about the importance of maintaining a safe distance, ideally 8 feet or more from someone who could be a threat.
Okay, good advice.
Yeah, he points out how quickly someone can close a 4-foot gap.
Yeah, in a flash.
Exactly.
That's true.
And then he has this interesting take on the traditional advice about controlling distance. He acknowledges that, a lot of people say that controlling the distance controls the fight.
Right.
But his point is that controlling distance is really about avoiding the fight altogether.
That makes sense.
Right. If they're close to someone who seems threatening, get away as quickly as possible.
Definitely.
If you can't get away and you're trapped,
right,
he says you need to quickly figure out your escape routes.
Okay.
And anything you could use as a weapon.
Right.
He also mentions that yelling can sometimes startle multiple attackers.
Really?
Yeah, and that changing your speed and rhythm can make you less predictable.
Okay, so don't be so easy to read.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And when it comes to actually striking someone, his philosophy is to be decisive and try to end the fight quickly.
Right.
Ideally with one well-placed strike.
One and done.
Exactly.
Okay.
He also suggests moving to the side of someone who's facing you directly to create an opening.
I see.
And then he goes on to give all these additional tips for all kinds of different situations.
Like what?
Well, really basic things like protecting your head.
Okay.
He also talks about considering the mental state of the person you're facing and trying to avoid harming them unnecessarily.
Okay.
Using hair to control someone's head.
Interesting.
Knowing the vulnerable parts of the body and practicing how to attack them.
Yeah, all practical stuff.
Right. He says don't overestimate your own abilities or underestimate your opponent.
Right.
Assume that anyone attacking you might have a knife.
That's a good point.
Right. And he even has some visual strategies.
Oh, like
looking at the chest of a single opponent.
Okay.
And at the ground if there are multiple attackers.
That's interesting.
Right. And he talks about reacting to the type of attack.
Okay.
Kicking a puncher and striking a kicker.
I see.
Dealing with multiple attackers by focusing on one at a time.
Right.
Understanding how adrenaline affects your body.
Yeah.
The importance of not being forced to a secondary location.
Right. Don't let him take you somewhere else.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he also gives some really practical tips.
Like what?
Like learning basic stretches.
Okay.
Trusting your gut feeling.
Right.
Letting someone know where you are and being cautious of suspicious people approaching you.
Good advice.
Right. And all throughout this practical advice, he still weaves in his ideas about mind power.
Yeah, he does.
He keeps coming back to that theme.
That's true.
He talks about how we give power to what we fight.
Okay.
And he encourages you to develop this mental image of yourself as someone who can handle threats.
So it's about believing in yourself.
Right.
I see.
He also stresses the importance of having a plan if you're with people you care about.
That's a good point.
And learning about different martial arts styles so you understand how someone might attack.
Okay.
He even suggests that being kind can create this kind of protective aura around you.
Interesting.
Right. And in this key insight that comes later in the book, he says that if you're aiming a kick at the knee, you should time it so that the person has most of their weight on that leg.
Oh, I see.
So you can cause the most damage.
To maximize the impact.
Exactly.
Okay.
He also encourages you to constantly assess your surroundings and move in ways that make your opponent keep adjusting.
So you're always one step ahead.
Right.
Got it.
He talks about using the closest weapon so you don't telegraph your attack.
Makes sense.
The importance of a healthy diet as a way of defending yourself against illness.
So it's all connected.
Right. Interesting.
And the concept of your personal safety zone.
Okay.
He advises prioritizing the free hand of an attacker who's grabbed you.
Okay.
And he has this really memorable saying.
Yeah, what's that?
He says, "He who runs away before the fight even starts lives to run away another day."
That's a good one.
Right. Very true.
Yeah.
And he ends by saying that if you like the book, you should thank Kathy.
And if not, you can blame him.
Fair enough.
Right. And he reiterates the responsibility that we all have to protect our loved ones and to have a plan.
Okay.
And finally, he shares some of his own personal reflections.
Okay.
In chapter 25, he talks about how he hasn't used physical violence in about 40 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah. And he attributes that to his self-defense wits.
Okay.
His foresight, awareness, common sense, knowledge, philosophy, strategy, will, mind power, and spiritual energy.
That's quite a list.
It is, yeah.
Wow.
He even claims an undefeated record.
What does he mean?
Because he says he's won every fight he's avoided.
Oh, I see.
But then in the very next chapter, he shares two stories where his aggressive verbal responses almost led to fights that he would have regretted.
Wow, what happened?
Well, one happened at a mall and the other one happened at Sunset Cliffs.
Okay.
And in both of these cases, he could have just walked away and avoided the whole thing.
Yeah, but he didn't.
He didn't.
Okay.
And he admits that he messed up.
Right.
So these stories really show the importance of de-escalation and self-control.
Even if you know how to fight.
Right.
Sometimes the best thing to do is walk away.
Exactly.
That's a good lesson.
So what are the main things we can take away from all of this?
Well, I think the first thing is that avoiding fights is always the best strategy.
Right.
Situational awareness is also crucial. You know, being aware of your surroundings, identifying potential threats early on.
Yeah, and then having some simple but effective physical techniques.
Like the low side kick and the leopard paw strike.
Right, and of course, this really unique aspect of his approach.
The mind, power, and spiritual energy part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a different way of looking at self-defense.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's definitely coming from a personal perspective.
Right, not from a professional expert.
Which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
It gives you a new way to think about it.
It does.
So for you, the learner, here's something to think about.
Okay.
Gabi really emphasizes avoiding fights.
Right.
And he tells those stories about how de-escalation was the better choice. So how do you think focusing on non-violent ways of dealing with conflict could make your self-defense strategy better?
That's a great question.
It's not just about the physical stuff.
Right.
It's also about your mental well-being.
It's about the whole package.
Yeah.
Right. So we want you to consider
Yeah.
which of these ideas resonate with you.
For sure.
Maybe you can explore these ideas of awareness and the power of your own mind a little more.
Even if you don't do martial arts.
Exactly.
Well,
think about your personal safety circle and how you handle potential threats.
That's a good exercise for anyone.
Right. And thank you for sending us this fascinating material
Yeah.
and for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
See you next time.
See you later.